Hello and welcome to another video. I'm Megan of Missy Magley Cosplay, and today I'd love it if you joined me as I return to the 1830s, taking you through how to make your very own romantic day dress. Perhaps you've been with me for my other forays into the 1830s, which were a set of stays as well as my very first day dress, both of which you can find on my channel. But regardless if this is your first time here or you're a time traveler visiting from the decade, I'm happy to have you. So without any further ado, let's get into it. You see, this is why I don't buy fabric online. This fabric was advertised as emerald green. I had bought this fabric for the garment you are seeing now, an 18th century poison ivy. However, its distinctly teal coloration meant I couldn't use it for that purpose, and as a result, I had 14 yards of the stuff just lying around. So I ordered a lovely light green for ivy and decided to return to the 1830s with the teal. And for this, I pulled out the required pattern. So you might recognize this pattern. This is my truly Victorian 1830s romantic era dress pattern. I've used it once before, which I'll put some footage in somewhere. And I really like this pattern. I think this is a great pattern. There are some things that I do ignore in this pattern, not because it's the fault of the pattern. For instance, they have you cutting this piece on the bias. Same thing with these big old sleeves. They have you cutting those on the bias, which I just don't do because I'm trying to save fabric. And last time it worked out perfectly well in terms of the hand of the fabric, and just because it was shot silk, it still looked good. Cut on that grain line, so I don't have to worry about that. One thing I'm going to do this time is I am actually going to, and I don't do this with patterns very often, this pattern is, I think, for somebody who's a little more long-waisted than I am, which is almost everybody. I'm very short-waisted. That just means that the distance between my bust and my hip is reasonably short. I'm going to raise the waistline a bit because last time it worked out fine. It just gave me a slightly later in the decade look than I wanted. I wanted a little earlier in the decade when the waistline would have been a little higher, and this was just a little bit lower than I wanted. So I'm going to raise the waistline. I'm also going to try to do the gathered front and back this time, which is going to be interesting. And I'm going to self-line because I have so much of this fabric and it was so cheap that I'm just going to self-line this. So it's going to be interesting. I look forward to it. Let's get into it. With my pattern modified, I started by cutting out the skirt panels, of which there are 3. As they are rectangular, all I did was measure the correct width and rip the fabric from selvage to selvage. This did leave me with some excess fabric for the hem, but more on that later. As the center front panel is slightly sloped in order to create a level hem, I simply folded it in half and marked the slope as indicated by the pattern, then trimmed the excess fabric away. Joining all 3 panels together was a cinch. The back panels were joined to each other with a few inches left open at the top for a placket, and then the other side of each of these back panels I joined to either side of the center front. After pressing these seams flat, I then folded the raw edge under and pressed it, finishing the placket by top stitching it in place. After this, I cut out the fabric for the lining. You might notice this is my fashion fabric, and this I did purely because I had such an excess of it. I would never do such a thing with silk taffeta, but as this was cheap poly taffeta and it was on hand, I opted to self-line. I also opted to create a separate lining layer, as opposed to the flat lining recommended by the pattern. There's nothing wrong with flat lining, and I did it before, but unless you finish the seam allowances on the inside of the garment, it'll leave you with raw edges. Here's what that looked like last time. While this is a garment that won't suffer as a result of these raw edges, I just didn't want that in this case. This meant that after cutting these pieces out, I constructed the bodice out of the lining. I'm not showing this process, however, as you will see the exact same thing when I created the actual bodice, but here's what it looked like at this stage. Then I could cut the outer bodice pieces out of the fashion fabric, which was, surprise surprise, the same poly taffeta. Before going any further, I opted to roll and top stitch the center back opening, as I hadn't yet decided whether I would interline, and if not, this center opening would have to house the boning channels. But then I did decide to interline. Though 1830s gown bodices likely would not have used interlining, they would have been made of and lined with a much thicker fabric than I had used, so the interlining here allowed me to achieve the appropriate historical effect. This I did by flatlining in the way suggested by the pattern. I simply laid each fashion piece atop its interlining piece and then top stitched around the outside to create a single piece. I do love the process of flatlining. It's simple, it functions as a way of stay stitching fussy fabrics, and it looks beautifully crispy. Okay, hello. You just saw me doing this, and this is what I've been working on for the better part of today. And after doing both sides and gathering it and all that, I realized I really don't like the look of it. Even though I was able to sort of gather this up, I wasn't really able to get it the way I wanted it to look, but I was able to sort of do it. I just really don't like the look. And there are a lot of extant examples that have a smooth back and a gathered front, where there's this sort of like pleated thing that comes down over the front that's a separate piece. So I think I'm actually just going to do the back smooth, and I think I'm gonna go from there. Yep, we're gonna do that. So I'm gonna take this apart and make it look like this. With the back smoothed, I could seam each back piece to its corresponding side piece, then clip and press the seam. Last time, I piped all these seams. This time, I wanted something a little different and piped only a few other seams, which you will see later. Okay, as I said before, I'm not really sure if I want the gathered front because I looked at the gathered back and I really didn't like it, as I said. So this will be the gathered front. So what I'm going to try doing is I'm going to try attaching just this part and around to here. Now for the other one, when I tried it with the gathered back, I also attached the neck down like this. But the reason why I'm not going to do that yet is what I think I'm going to try to do is I'm going to attach these parts and then I'm going to put in the dart and then I'm going to do that part. Because when this is attached like this and there's a little bit of bunching, actually there'll be a lot of bunching, I think that will make it more difficult to put the dart in. So I'm going to flat line, I'm going to top stitch all the way around here, put the dart in, and then attach that part and then get to checking to see whether I like the look of the gathers. As planned, I put in the darts. There are many ways to do this, but here I simply traced the dart onto both sides of the pattern, then pinned it atop the right side of the bodice. I used these pins to mark the placement of the dart as I more permanently marked the interlining with Sharpie. Then I could remove the pattern, fold along the marked line, and stitch the dart in place. Okay, so how I gathered it, it's not really gathering, I just kind of did these almost sort of rough pleats. So I did 3 there and 3 there. So far, I actually really like the look of it. With the gathers completed, I could join the 2 front pieces together along that center seam, lining up each gather to meet in a nice crisp point. After clipping and pressing open this seam, I could seam them along the front side seams to the side pieces, as well as to the back pieces along the shoulder seams, which connected all bodice pieces into one. Here's what the inside of the garment looked like at this point, with everything pressed open. To safely hide all this rawness, I then connected the bodice lining to the bodice. This I did in several steps. First, I laid the 2 pieces right sides together along the neckline. After seaming them together, I clipped the allowance and flipped the garment right way out, pressing the neckline into shape. Then I top-stitched lining and outer layers wrong sides together down the center back openings, after which I opted to bind this placket to create boning channels and for extra security, as this is a thin fabric that I don't trust. Binding is almost always the same for me. In this case, I laid a strip of fabric right sides together along my desired edge, stitched it down, then folded over that edge, tucking the raw binding edge inside to encase it. I top-stitched to secure, and for extra invisibility, I opted to stitch in the ditch. After this, I could slip the boning into the channels. You know me, these are zip ties cut down to size with the rough edges filed away. Then it was time to add the closure. For this I used hooks and eyes, and a lot of them to distribute the strain of this closure. Hooks and eyes are historically appropriate and very useful, although I always find them a bit finicky. And as someone who spends much of my time in the 18th century, a back closure on a gown is stupefying to me. And yes, I do have to have someone help me into this gown as a result. Here's how the bodice looked at this point, which meant it was time for sleeves. Okay, so here's my favorite thing about the 1830s. This is half of a sleeve. It's unreal. This thing is huge. And you see that right there? That gets pleated or gathered or whatever, I'm gonna gather it, down to fit the arm side. And the arm side is quite narrow. Other thing I'm going to do is, last time I lengthened by just putting a little bit of length down here, which usually works for me because normally sleeves are a little large around my forearms, so it's not like I have to lengthen midway to prevent it from being too tight on me. But this one, I think I'm going to try lengthening it where you're supposed to lengthen it. I'm going to give myself an extra couple of inches, and then if necessary, obviously you can just hem that. The other thing is that I'm going to try to get away without lining these. As I cut out the sleeves over the fold, I thought I'd let you know that I did indeed get away without lining either the sleeves or the skirt, both of which are a departure from the pattern, but is historically accurate. Often, if not usually, these pieces were not lined to allow them to be as light and therefore fluffy as possible. Before I could construct or attach them, I did decide to finish the waistline. This I did with piping. I opted to pipe the neckline and arm sides also, which I did for my previous day dress, but with a different technique. That involved sandwiching pre-made piping within the seam allowance, and while it worked, I just wanted to try something new. I'll show you the process for the waistline, as it was very similar for all the piping on this garment. This was also a very similar process to binding, but with the addition of cord. After top stitching all layers together, I attached binding to the outer layer, right sides together, with my desired seam allowance. Then I laid the cord along this line and folded the binding over it, top stitching it in place using a piping foot. Finally, I folded the binding inwards and stitched once more along that same line that secured the piping. So, you might wonder why I did that second part, which was to flip this over and stitch it down. The reason for that is twofold. First of all, you see this loose stuff right here? This is just the selvage, so this isn't going to fray. This was in part to neaten up under here, to encase that raw edge so that there won't be any raw edges. There might still end up being raw edges on the arm size. That's just a thing I'm going to live with. The other thing is to give myself a stitching line, because before when I flipped it over, there were a whole bunch of stitching lines from where I sewed it down, from where I'd stay stitched it, etc. So that when I apply the skirt and I seam them together, I know where to stitch so that I don't stitch over the cording, but I stitch close enough. You might say, Megan, why don't you just use the regular seam allowance? Well, no, this is just plain old easier, so this works for a number of reasons. Yay! This meant it was time to attach the skirt. In order to do this, I first had to gather it. This is always a simple and soothing process. Using a double thread, I simply ran a line of gathering stitches along the top edge of the joined skirt panels. Then I could pin the gathered skirt to the bodice, stroking the gathers as I went to keep the pattern of gathers even, and then seam skirt to bodice along the aforementioned stitching line. Here I kept the pins in as I was sewing, which is something I do rarely, but I was careful not to sew over them, and I find in this case it helps with stability. I also let the feed dogs do most of the work here to help avoid crushing or skewing the gathers. Here is what it looked like with the skirt attached. Quite pretty, I think. Sadly, this meant it was time to hem. After rolling the hem and stitching it down, it was still far too long, but that worked perfectly for my plans. I used backwards tucks in order to decrease the length of the skirt, add volume, and to add a little stylistic element often seen on gowns. These would likely have been done by piecing, but in this case tucks were easier, historically compliant, and added volume. These are backwards tucks because tucked petticoats usually show the tuck on the outside. To make them, all I needed to do was measure to the appropriate point, fold the skirt right sides together, and stitch as desired. Easy and pretty. Sleeve time! First, of course, I had to seam the sleeve, then clip and press it open. Clipping is especially important for a seam this curved. This time I also opted to omit a placket for each cuff, as I can still get my hand through the narrow opening, and it just simplifies matters not to have hooks and eyes here. Also, before attaching the sleeves, I had to pipe the arm size, which was a nearly identical process to the waistline, but more finicky as the arm size were quite small and thus more fiddly. The effect is well worth it, however. Just as with the skirt, I also had to gather the sleeve before setting it. As you saw earlier, the sleeve cap is enormous, and gathering it down to fit the small arm side gives it the characteristic Lego mutton floof. And it's fun! Finally, however, I could actually set the sleeves. My process for setting sleeves is usually similar. I turn the body of the garment inside out, then slip the sleeve in, right way out, into the arm side and pin it in place. As for many, but not all sleeves, I also lined up the sleeve seam with the bodice's middle center seam. I also carefully stroked the gathers as I was pinning, just as I had for the skirt. Then, with the piping foot still on, I seamed the sleeve in place. This I always do very, very slowly, adjusting as I go and leaving the pins in place. When it comes to setting sleeves, I find slow and steady really does win the race. And here is the gown at this point, a beauty complete with her piped arm size, which are so satisfying. The final step in construction was to finish the cuffs. I opted to bind these instead of hemming. To do this, I used that same binding method, stitching in the ditch to hide the top stitching. I like this method as it encases all raw edges, adds some strength to the bound edge, and is minimally visible. And a bound edge just simply looks better than a rolled and hemmed one, in my opinion. And with the addition of a few bows and a removable pelerine, the gown was done. If you'd like to see how to make your own pelerine, you can check out my previous video. I am delighted with how this gown turned out. As with most of my historical projects, it's both beautiful and comfortable, perhaps the most comfortable of all of my gowns. The gown is fluffy, soft, and warm, perfect for sitting by the fireside with a good book after a walk in the snow. So that's it for today. If you'd like to support me, a like, comment, or subscribe is much appreciated. I make lots of things, including cosplays, so you can check those out on my channel or on my socials. All information will be in the description box below. So until we meet again, take care, and I'll see you next time.